Okay, so apparently you guys are made of matter. Had no idea. And another thing, matter is made of elements. And the smallest unit of an element is an atom. So we're going to talk a little bit about chemistry. It says here that an element cannot be broken down into simpler substances. Well, not entirely. You can break a nucleus into protons and neutrons, and surrounding or orbiting the nucleus are electrons. So there's smaller things than that, but we're just going to mainly talk about elements and atoms and molecules. And there's this idea that nothing can be created or destroyed, and we'll see why that's not entirely true, but for our purposes, on the periodic table. So we're just going to go over the parts of an atom real quickly. Here's our nucleus, and they're made of protons right here, and then neutrons, these things, and then finally electrons. So protons are positively charged, neutrons have no charge, electrons are negatively charged. And in a nucleus, usually you're going to have protons and neutrons except for hydrogen, which you'll only have a proton. And for each proton that you have, you're going to have one electron. Okay, and then let's take a look at this. Atomic number. So hydrogen has an atomic number of 1 because it has 1 proton. So if you count up the protons, you'll get the atomic number. Carbon has 6 protons and 6 electrons, and it also has 6 neutrons, but we'll not worry about that, and you can see how it goes. And then the atomic mass number is just a combination of protons and neutrons. And just so you know, a proton has a value of 1 in terms of mass units, and a neutron about the same. So if you have carbon 12, that means you've got 6 protons, 6 neutrons, and 6 electrons. Okay, so you can kind of look at it here. Carbon, of course, is C. It's all big. And then the mass is, of course, 12, but a little bit more because neutrons and protons don't exactly weigh the same. Okay. So, how many protons, electrons, and neutrons does a hydrogen atom have? 1. Okay. So this is a schematic of what an atom looks like. It's got a nucleus in the center made up of protons and neutrons. It's held together by something called the strong force, which is in physics one of the four forces. And then around we have electrons. And they're actually in 3 dimensions, so they're not really following a path like this. They're like a big shell. And they're called orbitals. And orbitals, some are closer to the nucleus and some are farther away. And so also the electrons are not really, they follow the laws of probability. Namely that they're likely to be in a certain orbital, but it doesn't mean that they're actually there as a particle. It might be a wave. Okay, so each shell or orbital, the inner one, right here, only has 2 electrons for all atoms. And then the further out you go, with each additional orbital, each orbital can contain 8 total electrons. So, for example, with his element, with 2, 8, 8, that's 16, 18, some element with 18 protons, we could look that up. They have 3 orbitals, 2, 8, 8. Now these electrons are going to be what allows elements to interact to form molecules. Okay, so here's our hydrogen, 1 proton and 1 electron, just 1 orbital and only 1 electron, not 2. There's actually there's something called a heavy hydrogen deuterium, where it's actually a version, but it's hydrogen with a proton and a neutron. It's an isotope, which we'll get to. Okay. So, in chemical reactions, and basically life is just a series of chemical reactions. That's all it is. All you guys right now are just reacting away. Doesn't look like it though. But there's chemical reactions going on, and reactions essentially have to do with how electrons are divvied up between different elements. So here we have sodium and chlorine, and if you put these together into a reaction, sodium is Na. Cl. Sorry. And we have Na. Cl, which is sodium chloride. And if we actually look at this, we can see that what's happening here is sodium. Electrons always move from the outer shell to the inner shell. You fill up electrons or the orbitals from the inner to the out, but the ones that are donated or taken are always from the outer. So we've got sodium, which has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 11. Has 11 protons and 11 electrons. And then chlorine, I'm not going to count it up, has a certain number, and sodium is going to donate an electron to the chlorine atom. Chlorine is a really highly reactive molecule, so it gobbles up as many electrons as it possibly can. It's like a slothful creature that just can't keep its hands off of anybody else's electrons. Sodium is kind of weak and poor, and so he gets his, or she gets his electrons stolen all the time. So this is a chemical reaction where you have molecules of sodium and chloride. They react, chemical reaction, and you end up with a new product called sodium chloride. So in this case, the reactants are sodium and chlorine, and the product is sodium chloride. Okay. So here we are again. We've actually got two reactants, hydrogen. The molecule of hydrogen is actually two hydrogens, and two oxygens is a molecule of oxygen. And so you can see that on one side we have 4 hydrogen atoms and 2 oxygen atoms. And then when they combine, you end up with 2 water molecules, each with a hydrogen, oxygen and 2 hydrogens, H2O. And so you see we still have 4 hydrogens on the right compared to 4 hydrogens on the left, and 2 oxygens on the right compared to 2 oxygens on the left. And this is what we mean by conservation of matter. Now, whether an atom, what happened? What happens here? Okay. So, whether an atom actually reacts with other atoms, with other elements, depends on what's going on with the electrons in the outer shell. If the outer shell is completely full, that means it's considered inert. That means it's not going to react. In fact, there's some elements that basically never react. They're called noble gases. So they're inert, but we're mainly concerned with elements that react a lot. And so if there's, in the outermost electron shell, it's partially empty. Let's say the third electron shell should have 8 spots for electrons, and there's only 7, it means that it's more likely to react. So if it can either take another electron from another atom, or donate, or they can share, and these are different kinds of bonds. So molecules are basically atoms that are bonded together in various ways. Some bonds are stronger than others. Molecules are divided in terms of life, hydrophobic and hydrophilic. Hydrophilic means chemical reactions will dissolve in water. That means hydrophilic is water-loving. What are you drinking, water? Yeah, so you're hydrophilic. Yeah, he's lucky. Okay, and then hydrophobic, someone got bit by a rabid dog, and they didn't get treated before they died. They would be hydrophobic because it turns out that the rabies virus infects the brain and makes you, for some reason, afraid of water and also wanting to bite people. So if someone's trying to bite you, never mind. Okay, and then there's organic and inorganic. Anything with carbon is an organic molecule because we're basically carbon-based life forms. And then inorganic, sodium chloride, just a molecule, in this case table salt. So there's basically 3 kinds of bonds. There's ionic bonds, covalent bonds, and hydrogen bonds. Ionic bonds one party takes the electrons from the other. And so one of the atoms in this molecule is electronegative and the other is electropositive. And then covalent bonds is where they actually share electrons, 2 things. And then finally there's hydrogen bonds, and so we'll take a look at that. Hydrogen bonds are weak. They're the weakest between all the different bonds, and they actually don't form molecules together. The molecules essentially stay separated. Okay, so this is an ionic bond. We're going to go back to sodium chloride. Sodium atoms have 11 protons, 11 electrons, probably 11 neutrons, but maybe 12 or less if they're isotopes. And then chloride or chlorine, which has 17 protons and electrons, and then probably 17 neutrons, the most common isotope. And it grabs electrons from the sodium atom. And this is called an ionic bond. So here it is. Here's our sodium on the left, chlorine atom on the right. Chlorine grabs it, takes this, and drags it over into its own orbit. Okay. Covalent bonds. Covalent bonds, instead of one party grabbing all the electrons, they share. they're nice. You know, they get together, they give you everything up perfectly because they love each other. And a good example is methane. And methane has a central carbon atom, positively charged proton, actually there's a, yeah, that's right. So it'll be, in terms of number of protons, it's going to be 6. And then hydrogen all around. So hydrogen can make bonds easily with 4 different molecules, and that's why it's such a cool molecule. And in this case, instead of one of them, let's say the carbon, grabbing all the molecules, or one of the molecules for itself, and the hydrogen, they share. So the hydrogen has 1 electron, the carbon has 4 electrons. Hold on a second. Oh, carbon 4, yeah, okay. Is that right? Yeah. Okay, so, and then they share, and this is called covalent bonding. Okay, so for example, hydrogen has 1 electron in the first shell, carbon has 2 electrons in the first and another 2 in the second. You can have up to 8 in the second. And then each atom shares its own electron with the carbon. So this is covalent. Covalent and ionic both form molecules. Okay?
If you write anything on your computer, you need to get grammar.
I write pretty much all day, every day.
Most atoms don't ride solo. Instead, they bond with other atoms. Now, bonds can form between atoms of the same element, or atoms of different elements. You've probably imagined bonding as a tug of war. If one atom is really strong, it can pull 1 or more electrons off another atom. Then you end up with 1 negatively charged ion and 1 positively charged ion. And the attraction between these opposite charges is called an ionic bond. This is the kind of sharing where you just give away your toy to someone else and then never get it back. Table salt, sodium chloride, is held together by ionic bonds. Every atom of sodium gives up 1 electron to every atom of chlorine. Ions are formed, and those ions arrange themselves in a 3D grid called a lattice, in which every sodium ion is bonded to 6 chloride ions, and every chloride ion is bonded to 6 sodium ions. The chlorine atoms never give the sodium atoms their electrons back. Now, these transactions aren't always so cut and dry. If one atom doesn't completely overwhelm the other, they can actually share each other's electrons. This is like a potluck, where you and a friend each bring a dish, and then both of you share both dishes. Each atom is attracted to the shared electrons in between them, and this attraction is called a covalent bond. The proteins and DNA in our bodies, for example, are held together largely by these covalent bonds. Some atoms can covalently bond with just one other atom, others with many more. The number of other atoms one atom can bond with depends on how its electrons are arranged. So, how are electrons arranged? Every atom of a pure, unbonded element is electrically neutral because it contains the same number of protons in the nucleus as it does electrons around the nucleus. And not all of those electrons are available for bonding. Only the outermost electrons, the ones in orbitals furthest from the nucleus, the ones with the most energy, only those participate in bonding. By the way, this applies to ionic bonding too. Remember sodium chloride? Well, the electron that sodium loses is the one furthest from its nucleus. And the orbital that electron occupies when it goes over to chlorine is also the one furthest from its nucleus. But back to covalent bonding. Carbon has 4 electrons that are free to bond. Nitrogen has 3, oxygen 2. So carbon is likely to form 4 bonds, nitrogen 3 and oxygen 2. Hydrogen only has 1 electron, so it can only form 1 bond. In some special cases, atoms can form more bonds than you'd expect, but they better have a really good reason to do so, or things tend to fly apart. Groups of atoms that share electrons covalently with each other are called molecules. They can be small. For example, every molecule of oxygen gas is made up of just 2 oxygen atoms bonded to each other. Or they can be really, really big. Human chromosome 13 is just 2 molecules, but each one has over 37 billion atoms. And this neighborhood, this city of atoms, is held together by the humble chemical bond.
Oh, come on. So, I was going to get you guys to buy something called Top Hat, but it's expensive. It's like 26 bucks. So I decided not to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going on Canvas, I'm going to set up in-class quizzes and then I'll activate them. And so you're going to need some way to interact with the Canvas in class. Usually a smartphone of some sort or a tablet or something like that. If any of you have a problem, like you don't have those things, come and talk to me. So we're not quite to the point where we're starting yet, but for example, let's see. Anyway, it'll look like this. So we're just not doing it now, but this is what it'll look like. Ordinary table cells is composed of 1 positive and 1 negative ion. Which of the following types of bonds hold these ions together? And is it ionic? Yes. Yeah, ionic. Okay. So it's not polar. We haven't gotten to polar yet. It's not a covalent bond because they're not sharing. In this case, chlorine is taking sodium's electron, and it's not a hydrogen bond either. Okay. So, water is obviously important for life. It appears to be that we need it no matter what. We're mostly made up of water. And then when different elements can dissolve into water, you get a solution. And usually there's a solute that, in this case, some molecule or element, and then the solvent. And it turns out that water is a universal solvent. So you can have other kinds of solvents too. And what happens is they actually, this is where you get a lot of hydrogen bonds. Okay. It turns out, so polar molecules. So water is a polar molecule. What it means is they're held together by covalent bonds, but with unequally shared electrons. So the oxygen right here is holding on to the electrons more closely than the hydrogens. And as a result, oxygen has a little bit more kind of electrons that it's controlling. And anytime you have more electrons, it means you're electronegative. Okay? And anytime you lose electrons, you're electropositive. So a water molecule is actually a polar molecule where the oxygen has a negative charge because there's a covalent bond there, but it's a little bit unequal, not quite like an ionic bond. And then the hydrogens, of course, are slightly electropositive. And polarity is going to play a big role in how things get in and out of cells later on. Okay. Okay. So hydrophilic and hydrophobic, we mentioned this earlier. Hydrophilic, water-loving. Something is hydrophilic if an element or molecules dissolve into water. And hydrophobic, not. So the vinegar and olive oil in vinegar and oil in dressing has one part that's hydrophilic and the other part that's hydrophobic. Oil, lipids, fats, those kinds of things are always hydrophobic. And they're going to play an important role later when we look at how cells are put together. Okay. So, and then a little bit more about water. 3 phases. Well, all matter is in basically 3 phases. Not entirely true, but good enough. Solid, liquid, gas. So we've got ice, liquid water, and vapor. And then when things transition between different phases or states, then they either require energy or they give off energy. Okay? So melting, requires heat from the environment. Let's say you take an ice cube, you put it out in the sun, the heat's coming from the sun and it melts. Going from water to ice is the opposite. In that case, you're giving off heat to the environment. If the environment's cold, we'll get freezing. And then there's condensation and evaporation. You can read what those are. There's also other things where you go directly from a solid to a gas and vice versa. Okay. Also, water has a funny thing. Normally, when things turn from liquid to solid, they actually occupy less space because instead of things moving around, they're held together tighter. But water doesn't work like that. It actually gets into a lattice where a crystal that actually makes it expand. And that's why, interestingly, water in, let's say, a pond, the first part that normally it would probably freeze from the bottom up because it's colder down there, let's say, but actually, because of this lattice structure, it's on top. So you get ice on top and then water below. And that's really important in maintaining life because a lot of organisms need to live in water, liquid water, and not in ice. Okay. So, as hydrogen bonds, so when water is actually changing state from, let's say, a solid to a liquid, hydrogen bonds, the strength either increases or decreases. So if you go from a solid to a liquid, do you think the strength of the hydrogen bonds are going to increase or decrease? You could be wrong here. Anybody? You want to be wrong or right? You don't really care, right? So which one? No. Yeah. Good. No, I like it when people are wrong because then it's not that I want them to look bad. You're gonna actually get extra credit for this, okay? So hydrogen bonds, the strength increases when it becomes a solid, when it freezes, when the temperature goes down. When the temperature, when the hydrogen bonds decrease, then the molecules are spread further apart, and you get something that's going from a liquid to a gas or something like that. So hydrogen bonds develop readily between the adjacent molecules of water. With partially positive pole at one molecule tugging at and being tugged at the partially negative pole of a neighboring water molecule. When water freezes, hydrogen bonds become more rigid and the water molecules become stacked in a 3D network, which is a crystal. Water molecules are actually spaced further apart, an ice crystal making ice less dense, which is unusual. Usually a solid is more dense. And then when water heats up, energies from the heat break the bonds, and the bonds of intact hydrogen bonds decreases as the temperature rises. Okay, and these are macaque snow monkeys in Japan, and they like to get in hot springs as much as anybody else. And they just kind of hang out there all day. Okay. Okay. There's another thing about acid, about water, and in terms of acids and bases. So acids and bases are chemical opposites of each other and can neutralize each other. So acids, let's say sulfuric acid, donates hydrogen ions, that's just one hydrogen instead of two, to the surrounding, let's say, water. And then bases accept hydrogen ions from their surroundings. So the pH scale represents the concentration of hydrogen ions. And human blood, as you can see, has a pH of about 7.4. Neutral is at 7. So when the pH of, let's say, our blood gets out of whack, it puts us in a really dangerous situation. So, for example, some people, let's say, might drink excessive amounts of water, which dilutes the blood, and some people have actually gotten seriously sick, especially after, let's say, a marathon or something. They think, oh, I've got to rehydrate as quickly as possible. You can overdo it. So, which has a higher concentration of free hydrogen ions? Vinegar has 2.8, milk 6.5. So if you have a higher pH, that means you have more hydrogen ions. You're getting into the acidic part of the spectrum. Okay. So carbon atoms are strange. And they're basically the reason why there's life. Because they form 4 bonds, and they can be arranged in what are called long strings of monomers, or that become polymers. So a carbon atom can bond with up to 4 other atoms because it has 4 valence electrons in its outer shell, and it's got space for 4 more. No other element, because of that, can actually do the things that carbon can. Okay. So when we talk about organic compounds, we talk about carbon compounds. Anything with carbon is what we consider to be organic. Now, it used to be thought that only organic compounds only came from living things, but it turns out that's not true. So methane is an organic compound, and during cellular respiration, methane is released by the organism, so it's making it. But you can actually get non-living chemical reactions to produce methane. Okay? So the idea that all organic compounds come from life is not true. It used to be thought that way. But certainly all life is made up of organic compounds. So and we talked a little bit about functional groups, including, here we go. A little bit about functional groups, and these are attached. I think we saw a little video on it, to other molecules, and they are involved in specific chemical reactions. And some common ones are hydroxyl, which are basically OH negative, they're an ion, or amine groups found in amino acids. So anytime you have a molecule, let's see, where's my, there. So R, and then let's say the functional group, OH negative, they're attached that way with a bond. life. And we're dealing with the molecules of life. Okay. And then so when we do a couple of things with molecules, we can either break them down or build them up. When we build them up, usually requires energy, and it's called catabolism. And then when we're actually, anabolic. And then, so we're building monomers, like up on top here. Here's our monomers. You put them together, and then you can make a polymer as many monomers all strung together. Some of them are short, maybe 5 or 6. Others could be 1,000,000 monomers long. And then catabolic, where we actually break things down, and that usually requires enzymes, but it doesn't take as much energy. Okay, so one of the biomolecules is carbohydrates or sugars. We kind of went over this, but I mentioned usually with carbohydrates, we think of them as food. It's carrying energy, basically glucose. But they do other things as well, including they form the backbone of nucleic acids, which are DNA. And then there's proteins. So let's take a look. Okay, so proteins are made of amino acids. We're going to learn about how we get amino acids. Actually, we get all of these biomolecules, for the most part, we get from our food, or we make biomolecules. Our body makes them. There are 20 amino acids, and amino acids are strung together to form proteins.
There's 20 in total?
Huh?
You said there's 20 in total? Like in total, there's 20 amino acids?
Say again?
Is there 20 in total?
Total. 20 amino acids. And there's actually more, but all of life on Earth only uses 20 amino acids. And we'll get to this later, but they're coded by DNA. Okay, so the DNA makes instructions for how to build a protein, and those instructions are how to string which amino acid following which, so that a protein has a certain function, whether it's catalyzing reactions, or whether it's a structural protein like my hair or my bones or whatever. Storage proteins, membrane transport proteins, antibodies, which are part of our immune system. All these, the hormones, these are all proteins. In other words, proteins do all the work, and they're just made completely of amino acids strung together in a 3-dimensional shape. Let's see. So, again, proteins are polymers. That means long strings of amino acids. The chain folds further into a 3D shape, So here's our, let's say, protein all strung out here. And then take a look, and this should actually have a 3D shape, and it probably has a functional site where I can grab onto some other protein or some other substance. Antibodies, of course, are, let's say, antibodies to tetanus. Tetanus produces a toxin, and so we produce antibodies to actually neutralize that toxin. So there are 4 levels of protein structure. The simplest is just a chain of amino acids. And then they fold into 3D shapes. And this is kind of what an amino acid looks like. So in general, the R right here is the side group that it's attached to. Okay. Let me see something.
Proteins are assembled from amino acid subunits. Living organisms use 20 different amino acids in their protein, 5 of which are shown here. Although the main structural elements of amino acids are the same, they vary at one location, giving each amino acid different properties from the others. Amino acids are types of monomers, single units that can form a chain called a polymer. An amino acid chain is also called a protein, which is a type of polymer. In the protein, the amino acids are connected to each other by covalent bonds. Amino acids assemble into different sequences that make up the thousands of unique types of proteins in a living organism. The varying amino acid sequences result in proteins with different structural and functional properties. Proteins are a type of large organic molecule called a macromolecule and range in size from a few dozen amino acids in a chain to many thousands. The amino acid sequence is the first of 4 levels of protein structure. In the second level, the amino acid chain folds into coils or sheets. In the third level of protein structure, the chain folds further into a 3-dimensional shape that supports the protein's function. In the fourth level, some proteins join together with other proteins, forming larger functional complexes.
Okay. Okay. And then there's also, like I said, carbohydrates. They're also polymers. They're just things, instead of having amino acids, they're basically sugars or carbohydrates.
Except they're basically sugars?
They're sugars,
Oh, sugar.
yes. And so the simplest one is a monosaccharide. Mono means single, saccharide means sugar, and that's basically glucose, which is the energy molecule of life. And then we have disaccharides, in other words, 2 monosaccharides stuck together. And table salt, table sugar, sucrose is a good example. And then we have complex carbohydrates like potatoes and all that, and that's thousands of monosaccharides stuck together. They're good for short-term energy storage, and we'll learn later that the cell actually takes them, because monosaccharides or saccharides are stuck together with covalent bonds. When they're broken, that can release lots of energy. And so our body takes glucose, breaks it down, and then eventually transforms it into a molecule called ATP, which is the actual energy currency of the cell that drives all cellular function. Anytime it needs energy to accomplish what it does. So, the cell's fuel makes and then there's a structure. So, like I mentioned, this is DNA, and each of these backbones, the actual, let me actually make this larger. So these are nucleic acids, but the whole structure of DNA is held together by these carbohydrate phosphate chains, like this, along here and along here. It's a double helix, so there's two of them. So they also provide basically the support for DNA and RNA. And then a lot of, there's also structure that they're used like in plants for cellulose for fiber, or chitin, which is the outer shell, let's say, of insects. I think our hair is made of chitin, and then some other things like peptoglandin. So they do more than just actually provide energy. So tubers, potatoes, they have starch. These are long chains of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates in our body are actually stored in the liver and muscles, and it's called glycogen. And that's actually what, when we're burning, when we're doing exercise and we need energy, that's what we burn up in the beginning. So we have monosaccharide pairs. Here's a simple sugar, it's glucose. You stick a bunch of them together, long chains, you have long carbohydrate chains that have to be broken down. And then peptoglycans are the cell walls of bacterial cell walls. So all kinds of different things. Okay, so nucleic acids, the third macromolecule. This is the stuff of inheritance. There's two forms that we're aware of, DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, and it's made up of these deoxyribonucleotide monomers, and then ribonucleic acid is like DNA, except it's single-stranded instead of double-stranded. And it's used in the process of DNA coding for proteins. It's then turned into a template that then is read off and turned into a protein by stringing together amino acids. Okay? And there's other RNAs. It turns out there's a lot more RNAs. A lot of them are involved in gene regulation. So DNA is more stable than RNA, less subject to mutations that don't get corrected, mainly because it's double-stranded and there's nucleotides that connect together, and they always come in pairs, and so it's easy to make, let's say when a cell is undergoing, is dividing into a new cell, you make all the DNA, you make 2 copies of it, so 1 for each cell. So this is our genes, and then, as I mentioned, RNA is used for translating or transcribing DNA into RNA and then into a protein. And there's also some things like viruses that actually, a lot of viruses are only made with RNA and not DNA, okay? And there's a thought actually that perhaps the first life was RNA-based and not DNA-based, and it was replaced because DNA is a lot more stable. So different combinations of nucleotides are strung together and form the DNA that then we can translate into RNA. So this is what protein looks like, a DNA looks like. You can see the different colors, 2 different colors. There's what are called 4 bases, nucleotide bases. We'll learn about those. Adenine, thymine always go together, A and T. Cytosine, guanine always go together. And then RNA has, instead of thymine, they have uracil. And then finally, lipids are the 4th category. They're fats. And they can be combined with proteins, like into steroids. They come in different forms. They're again, they're not actually polymers because they're not a chain of monomers, but they can still be made into long chains. And they do a number of different things. Triglycerides composed of 3 fatty acid molecules linked to a glycerol molecule, and it provides long-term energy storage in both plants and animals. Among other things, phospholipids are part of the cell membrane, and we'll get into that shortly. And then steroids are like hormones like cholesterol. They're hydrocarbon rings, organic molecules and fatty acids stuck together. So here's a hydrocarbon, and then lipids are a diverse group of, and they're hydrophobic. That means they don't bind with water. Remember, we talked about hydrophilic and hydrophobic. And then let's see, where's fatty? Oh, okay. Anyway, that's good enough. So these are all critical for life. Okay.